Samsung S95C is a great gaming TV to many. However, there are quite a few people who do want to be able to tone it down and make it more accurate. So in this video we're going to be going over how to make the S95C the most accurate that it can be, because out of the box, and even with some tweaks that a lot of people would try, there's a lot of oversaturation, some overbrightening, and there are a lot of people who do care about accuracy in gaming. So we're going to start out with setting up the consoles correctly. On the PS5 you're going to pretty much leave everything on automatic, and then for the HDR setup you're going to go all the way darker, and then you're going to count upwards 20 clicks for both white screens, and then on the dark screen you're going to just go all the way darker. PC will be in a separate video. If you already have the TV in Game HDR Basic, then when doing this you'll see the icon will clip. But you don't need the TV to be set up yet in order to do this, because it's just going to end up being 20 clicks for the white screens. And then when we move over to the Xbox, you see we can force it to 120 Hz all the time. Everything is supported except for Dolby Vision. And then under general video modes, this is how I have it set up. And then video fidelity, auto, standard color space, and 10-bit. You can set it to 8-bit and it'll automatically switch, but it doesn't matter. Alright, and then when we go to set up the HDR, it's going to trigger game mode and put the TV into HDR. You can hold the play and pause button to bring up the game bar, but essentially on the Xbox for the white screens, if you pull both the left and right bumper and left and right trigger at the same time, you get the little menu at the top right. So you can set it to 2000 nits for both screens, and then 0 for the final black screen. Ignore the moire or whatever's going on there in the video footage, that's just something from the camera. It's not on the TV. That's going to be your essentially HGIG for the PlayStation 5 and Xbox. I say essentially because the TV is still tone mapping some, and this is with firmware 1123. There is another HDR mode we're going to be talking about, and that's setting to the original preset. So if you were to turn off Game HDR, then the presets become available, and if you were to select original, then you would have to redo this and set it to about 4000 nits. It's still going to keep tone mapping above that, but regardless, I'm not going to recommend actually doing this, and we'll cover this further a little bit ahead. But if you were to do it, you could set to 4000, but it's not recommended. However, original still does work well with some HDR, but before getting to that, set over to the Nintendo Switch. Everything can be on automatic. And then here I have original and standard set up to the same picture settings, and you can see there's a huge difference between them. In SDR, if you're going for accuracy, you absolutely want to use original. Look at all the detail that you gain on Bowser right here in that red that just completely clips on standard. Something else for the Nintendo Switch is the Game Motion Plus. If you come here and you can turn on clear motion, which is black frame insertion. A lot of people don't like it. A lot of people do. Usually people don't like it because of the flickering and the cut in brightness. However, the flickering most people would get used to after a short amount of time. And then for the brightness, if you put the peak brightness on high, it's still very, very bright. However, if you are in an exceptionally bright room and you just want max SDR brightness, then you turn it off and it is extremely bright. Alright, so now that all the systems are set up how we want them, I'm going to start going into the actual TV picture settings and where to use that original picture mode. But we are going to have to look at a few charts here first, just so you can see why, as well as the color setting is important as well. So starting with original versus standard and HDR, you can see they're pretty similar, although original here on the bottom does follow that EOTF a bit tighter, and just by setting the shadow detail setting to -2 would pretty much fix that hump at the bottom on original. Now if we look at color with the P3 saturation, again we can see original on the bottom, and this is after manually setting standard to the P3 gamut color option, whereas on original you don't have to do that, it already does it. And looking at a full color checker, again you see much better color errors with the original preset. Now however, with the Game HDR Basic, if we do make some adjustments and some setting changes, we can get that better. So that's what this is. This is showing EOTF and color checker on Game HDR Basic with the settings I'm going to show in just a bit. One more quick look at SDR with standard versus original. Again, this is with the same settings on both, and you can see quite a drastic difference here. So in SDR, we want it on original. One thing to keep in mind is when you do that and then you go to HDR, if you're in HDR original, then your settings are the same between SDR and HDR. So when we turn down the contrast to fix clipping, then you would have to reset that every time you go to HDR if you were to use original in HDR. Now also I'm showing right here what happens in some games like Sea of Thieves. If you set it to 4000 nits, you don't have shadows anymore, like they are completely raised. So this is another reason why using original is a nice option to have, but it does not work well when you are setting the games to 4000 nits in at least some games, or it's pretty mixed. I tested a lot of games and it was pretty 50-50 of whether everything got raised when you change the brightness versus just the highlights. So now that we're going to use Game HDR on basic, we need to adjust the color, and most people would probably measure and see that around 18 gives you the best result, which up here on the top you can see it's at 18 and at the bottom it's on 22. But there's a problem when you only measure one stimulus level, and now if we measure a darker 30% stimulus, we see at the top with 18, now we're undersaturated by a large amount, and we don't want that. So 22 seems to be the best balance throughout the entire range. So with Game HDR Basic on, we're going to set the color to 22, and this is with the color gamut changed to auto or P3. If you're on auto, just make sure under custom it's on P3, because that's what auto will set it to. Brightness and contrast leave at 50. Sharpness you can set to 0, or if you want to turn that up, that's up to you. And then the tone mapping will be static already with it on basic. Contrast enhancer off. Color tone warm 2. Fix the EOTF. We got to go -1 on the ST2084 and -2 on shadow detail. And then that's it. That's really all you need for Game HDR Basic to get it how I showed in the charts earlier. And I have calibrated multiple of the S95Cs at this point, and this has been the same for all of them. They're really pretty consistent overall, except for in the white point, so don't copy white balance settings because that varies greatly with Samsung. Alright, now if we go to Destiny, where the highest we can set the nit slider is 2000 nits, which happens to work out well for this with using Game HDR Basic. It would not work as well if you were to use original HDR because you can't set it higher than 2000. And then you do need to set the midpoint to balance out the rest of the image, but once you do that, it looks really good. But now what I want to do is show how this looks against the G3, which is fully calibrated and will show what HGIG is supposed to do and supposed to look like. And with the Samsung as best as you can get it, ignore the tint difference that's from the camera, but just try to look at the highlights of the clouds. And now you can see if I reset, like by going to the home screen on both, and then switching back, you can see where the Samsung was dimmer is now brighter. So ASBL is a bit of an issue with the TV that can be corrected in the service menu. But regardless, now that they're both at their full brightness ability, you see that the G3 does have brighter, more defined highlights, and there's really nothing you can do about that. However, when just looking at the S95C by itself without the G3 next to it, it still is very impressive and looks really good. Alright, so when should you use the original picture preset in HDR? Well, that's going to be some games that do not use the system level setting and do not have nit slider in the game, like God of War. So if we look at that orange cloud in the center, as I adjust the brightness here with it in Game HDR Basic, I have to turn it down to about 35, and you can see as I move the slider how the entire image, the dark areas and everything is changing as well. So essentially, you can't really get a correct image with the Game HDR setting turned on basic and using that. So if we do change this to original, again, you got to turn off Game HDR. And because we are using original for SDR, we have to go into the settings and change these for HDR. So the contrast in SDR has to be 38 to avoid clipping. And then the shadow detail is fine at -2, both SDR and HDR. Peak brightness I set to medium in SDR. You could leave that on high if you like it that way. But either way, you got to make sure the contrast is back at 50 and the peak brightness is on high. Now with the original setting for HDR, you can see at 50-50 on God of War it was fine. We can even increase a little bit here to 65 just to gain a little bit extra brightness, because we do lose a little bit of brightness using original because of the tone mapping. And you can offset that a little bit by adjusting the contrast, but either way this ends up being a better result because you can make it where it's bright and you have detail. Now if we go over to Hogwarts Legacy, we have a slider that goes up to 6,000. You can see there's hardly any difference between 4 and 6,000, but if you turn it down, there's a huge difference. So that's where 4,000 is fine. And we can also see as we adjust the slider in this game, there is no change to the rest of the image. It stays the same, so your shadows and everything stay fine. Now what I will do is show what this game looks like at 4000 with original, and with it set to just about 2000 with game HDR basic. And while the brightness levels are very similar and overall it's very similar, you do see that the highlights in original do get a little more blown out and less defined than using the game HDR basic set up to 2000 nits. And that's why for just about most titles you should use the game HDR basic with it set to 2000, and only in instances like God of War where you don't have a nit slider and it doesn't use the system level setting should you turn off the game HDR and use original preset. Yeah, so here's where you can see on top with game HDR that fire is a bit more defined. Okay, so that's pretty much it for how to set up the TV and when to use original. Again, always use original for SDR. If you're looking for accuracy, it is the most accurate mode by quite a big margin. For HDR, as long as you set it to game HDR on, when you switch your games from an SDR game to an HDR game, it will take it out of original and turn on game HDR and you're fine. Now, if you turned off game HDR to play a game like God of War, and then you play something in SDR and it's also in original, and then you go to play something else in HDR, then you would have to manually turn game HDR back on to get it out of original. In SDR with original, pretty much all of the settings are fine. You do need to lower the shadow detail to -2. It is overly brightened on the bottom, and the contrast does clip at its default, so you want to turn that down to 38. After that, it's pretty much as good as you can get it for SDR gaming. And as I also stated earlier, with HDR, with the game HDR setting, you would set the color to 22 after putting the gamut in P3. The BT 2020 option is not accurate at all. Don't recommend using that. Even with trying to adjust CMS and stuff, it doesn't work out well. And it is extremely rare that any color is going to go outside of P3 anyway, so it's really not a visible gain. When you do toggle between the P3 and BT 2020 setting, all you are really seeing is the oversaturation of the color. You're not actually seeing an increase in the gamut because the content doesn't provide that increase. Also, there are random bugs that some people may or may not have. Some people with the Xbox set to original, they're not clipping at 4000 or above, it's clipping too early and it's blowing things out and lowering contrast and everything, and it looks terrible. But luckily on the Xbox you don't have to worry about that too much, as not many games would you need it. And I've also seen a bug where if you change game HDR off and then back to basic, it will continue to tone map like it's off, and it shouldn't do that unless you change the tone mapping setting from static to active back to static, and then it resets it. So there are some bugs, there are some issues, and firmware may fix or change any of this at any time. So I will continue to do firmware testing throughout the year, so subscribe and keep an eye out for those. And I thank you all for watching. I hope this helps you out, and I hope to see you in the next one.